So welcome to the Institute of Medicine of Chicago. My name is Deborah Hodges, and I'm the program manager and association manager for the Institute of Medicine of Chicago. And thank you for attending today's webinar, Fluoride, Facts and Myths with Dr. Stephen Levy from the University of Ohio. So I've been with IOMC since 2019, so it's a pleasure to be with you today. We're going to cover just a few items here in regards to today's agenda. Today's session addresses the often debated issue of fluoride, its benefits, the risks, economic impact, and the future implications if it is removed from our preventative health ecosystem. And if you're new to IOMC, welcome. We hope that you'll find that IOMC is your trusted resource for health care and public health information. Today's agenda, just to give you an idea of how we'll cover everything, is we're going to address a couple of upcoming programs. Dr. Levy will give his presentation. We will ask you to use the chat box for any comments that you'd like to make during the presentation. And then put your questions in the question box, and we'll address those at the end of the presentation today. So there's a very robust presentation altogether. And we're pleased to have Dr. Levy with us today. So Dr. Levy is with the University of Iowa. He's the Wright Bush Shreves Professor of Research Graduate Program, the Associate Director of the Dental Public Health. He's also a part of the Department of Preventative and Community Dentistry, also the Training Grant Director, and a professor with the Department of Epidemiology with the College of Public Health. So we're pleased to have him with us. If you're new and you're to IOMC, let me just share a few details about the Institute. It's celebrating its 110th anniversary this year in 2025, and it's an independent nonprofit organization of distinguished leaders in the health field, and they collaborate to improve the health of the public. It draws upon the expertise of its membership, which is very diverse, and other regional leaders. It also addresses critical health issues through a range of interdisciplinary approaches, including education, research, sharing trusted information, and community engagement. It is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have a very exciting event that's coming up in January. It's called the State of Health of Chicago. This is its 20th year. It's the 10th convening overall. It'll be on January 23rd. It'll be held at Maggiano's in Chicago. There will be a panel of speakers. It'll be an interactive session on multiple topics. Everyone is welcome, and it's going to be addressing the challenges and opportunities to advance our community's health. So feel free to look for more details on this in the next few days, to register and also see who the speakers are. And if you're interested to be a sponsor, please contact us at the IOMC office for that information as well. So if you're not a fellow of IOMC, we highly encourage you to look into becoming a fellow. It is open to everyone. It's a highly esteemed group of thought leaders. As I said earlier, all the membership is interested in promoting social change for to improve access to care, and there's many tangible benefits. There's education programs, work groups that work on specific projects, and also establish a valuable and a strategic partnership with our organization. You can go to the website, look under the membership tab, and you'll find the information on how to become a member of IOMC. And also, if you're not a member, or if you are a member, we hope that you take advantage of the Career Job Center with IOMC. I checked this morning, there's over 5,000 jobs listed in that job portal. So if you're looking for your next career destination, that's the place to check it out. So right now, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Levy, because that's the reason why you're here, is to hear about today's presentation. So Dr. Levy, I'm going to turn this over to you now.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Deborah, for setting the stage and inviting me to participate. I think I'm going to need you to advance the slides because it's not working from here. But just very briefly, some major learning objectives to understand about fluoride's benefits, early and recent studies on effectiveness, cost effectiveness and cost savings, current recommendations, and likely impact and costs of discontinuing water fluoridation. Discuss some of the adverse health claims made against community water fluoridation, including an emphasis on IQ and neurodevelopment, and discuss some of the recent studies and reports that have addressed water fluoridation, including the National Toxicology Program's fluoride monograph, a lawsuit against EPA, and the JAMA Pediatrics publications from January. And then we'll also look at some other more recent studies that relate to all of that and the implications for community water fluoridation. Next slide. So again, I put in parenthesis here, it's somewhat also an update on fluoride and water fluoridation, but we have this more provocative title to deal with. So next slide, Deborah, please. I don't have any financial disclosures. As some of you may know, I serve on the National Fluoride Advisory Committee of the American Dental Association. I have received several research and other grants and contracts from the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research. So we have those objectives for you to be thinking about, but here's how I've structured things. Going to talk about other fluoride modalities briefly to set the stage. There was a recent FDA restriction on use of dietary fluoride supplements we'll talk about briefly. Then we'll go to talk about the history and basic mechanisms of fluoride, and then talk about community water fluoridation, benefits and public health advantages, and then on to the discussion of possible associations with IQ and neurodevelopment. And then I'll also talk briefly about some unique results we have looking at fluoride intake in our Iowa bone development study. So just to let you know, many of these products that are outlined here are ones that different attendees will be familiar with. We're all familiar with fluoride toothpaste. And from a public health standpoint, I've just briefly noted that it's recommended for all, but it requires regular patient or caregiver compliance. Fluoride mouth rinse, we generally recommend more targeted for high risk. It again requires compliance, and there are both high concentration prescription products and low concentration over-the-counter ones. Fluoride varnish has become the main approach for topical fluoride in the dental office and medical office. In recent years, it's recommended for all young children and others at high risk, but it does require the professional visit, but it doesn't require daily compliance. Most dental offices used to use gel and foam instead of varnish. Some still do. So the same criteria, high risk, targeting, and requiring a professional visit. Silver diamine fluoride is another product that is recommended for high risk, requires the professional visit. It is to both arrest or stop current decay and to prevent future decay. It's targeted a little more specifically because the tooth structure gets stained from the silver, but it can be especially valuable for institutionalized, medically compromised, and other high-risk individuals where they may not be able to get to the dentist or physician easily, or to get other forms of prevention. And then dietary fluoride supplements are the drops and tablets, recommended often for those who don't have fluoridated water when they have high risk, and again requires very substantial patient and caregiver compliance. Next. So just a brief update about the dietary supplements before we get on to water fluoridation. In May, the FDA announced their intention to stop allowing dietary fluoride supplements by the end of October. They said it was because they'd never been reviewed and approved officially. And there was some text from Commissioner Makary about ingestion being related to altered gut microbiome and thyroid, weight gain, and possibly decreased IQ. But in my opinion and others' opinions, the scientific evidence did not show that. The microbiome was taken out of context of the articles. And he went on to say that the best way to prevent cavities in children is by avoiding excessive sugar intake and good dental hygiene. And when a New York Times reporter talked with me soon after, I really was concerned because that's not a realistic public health approach, and was quoted as saying, if you're able to control the public's excessive sugar intake and get them all to have good dental hygiene, then you should get more than one Nobel Prize. And this is especially problematic in Utah, where the law banning community water fluoridation was established to allow pharmacists to dispense supplements without a prescription. So then if supplements are not as available, that's a problem. They went ahead and had a public comment period and then had a single couple-hour public hearing. In my opinion, the new division director that started that week was very biased and arrogant and clearly had his mind made up. Several prominent opponents of fluoridation spoke and he praised them. And there were too few people that got to speak on the benefits of fluoride, too few minutes of discussion. And then they closed that. And if anyone's interested, they can track down all that information on the reaganudall.org on their website. So the next slide summarizes where we are now. They did have their announcement the last day of October, Halloween. It is less restrictive than expected, not a full ban. Dietary supplements now are approved only for those aged 3 and above, not from 6 months to 2.99 as before, specifically targeting at high risk even more than before. But for physicians, for dentists, for other providers that have the licensing capability to prescribe, or for the pharmacies in Utah, vitamin fluoride combinations were not covered by this. This is just for fluoride only. And physicians and dentists can still prescribe the fluoride supplements off-label after appropriate shared decision-making with the parents. At the bottom here, I have, let's go back one second, I have some links, but importantly, the FDA, I hope, will not take action against fluoride toothpaste, mouth rinses, or the office fluoride treatment, because they're also extremely important for all of the public. Thanks, Deborah. So now some basic information on fluoride. Fluorine is a naturally occurring, very common element in the Earth's crust. Detectable fluoride can be found in virtually every natural water source, but surface water sources like rivers generally have relatively low fluoride concentration, while the deeper wells often have higher fluoride. But it's important to realize water fluoridation does not add anything brand new to the water. It just takes the lower concentration of fluoride already in the water up to the recommended level if needed. And just a brief history, the way that the scientific community found out about fluoride originally was when Dr. McKay started his dental practice in Colorado Springs, saw that some patients had appearance like this on the right that was called Colorado brown stain or mottled enamel, and we now more correctly call dental fluorosis. But he noted that the stain, as well as much milder forms of the mottled enamel, conferred substantial caries prevention. Whatever was causing it was associated with very few regular cavities, hypothesized it was something in the water. Eventually, with better chemistry analyses, they figured out it was a very low level of fluoride. And then H. Trenley Dean and the U.S. Public Health Service did extensive investigations, mostly in the upper Midwest, about water fluoride caries and dental fluorosis. Next slide, please. And this just briefly summarizes on the x-axis going from 0 to 1 to 2 parts per million, and on the y-axis, the prevalence of either dental caries or dental fluorosis. And if you look here, you can see that The red or orange is showing a very steep negative slope to this curve, getting down to 1, and it continues to get lower, going to 2, and even to 3 would be lower caries. And there was virtually no dental fluorosis at 1 part per million, all very mild, none of the mottled or Colorado brown stain type of dental fluorosis. Next slide, please. So in terms of mechanism of action, we now understand that the mechanism of action is both systemic and topical, but primarily topical. This topical occurs through promoting remineralization on the outside of the tooth and inhibiting the microscopic cavities or demineralization before they become an actual cavity. Now, water fluoridation provides systemic benefits during tooth development, which is just the first few years of life, like till age 3 or 4 for the front permanent teeth. But it provides those topical benefits I just mentioned. And it gives a direct topical benefit when the water is in your mouth before you swallow it. And then it provides additional important topical benefit when it goes to the bloodstream and saliva and comes back to bathe the tooth, getting topical exposure again. Next slide, please. So after they realized that this naturally occurring fluoride was conferring so much cavity prevention, they decided to do several experiments to make sure that if they added fluoride, they'd get the same sort of cavity prevention. And they decided to use 1 milligram per liter, which is the same as 1 part per million. And there were 4 paired studies starting in the mid-40s, with Grand Rapids being the very first compared to Muskegon, Michigan. 80 and a half years ago, they started, and all 4 of these found about 45 to 70% less decay or less dental caries. And then they went on to begin to fluoridate intentionally many cities and towns across the country. Next slide, please. It's important to realize, however, that at that time there were no fluoride toothpaste, mouth rinses, varnishes, or anything else. So now that we have those other products, it's natural that the actual benefits from water fluoridation would be smaller. And we call that the dilution effect with having multiple sources. And also, I live outside Iowa City and don't have fluoridated water, but my family and I spend much of our time in Iowa City, Coralville on fluoridated water systems. So children and adults often are getting water that's fluoridated, and products can be fluoridated. So for all those reasons, the differences are smaller, and there has been some controversy that the latest Cochrane review on the bottom of the slide found only about 8 to 15% less decay in the primary teeth and 3 to 4% more caries-free children, much less than the 24 to 34% found before that, or the 45 to 70% found 80 years ago. Next slide, please. However, there are several studies, actually a flurry of newer studies from the US and other countries in the past 8 to 10 years that have found that water fluoridation still has substantial caries preventive importance. The first one here is from NHANES data from the US national data. And those counties, if you could go back briefly, that counties that had 75% or more of their population with fluoridated water versus less than 75, there was about 30% prevention in the baby teeth and 12% in the permanent teeth. And then a 6-year longitudinal study from England found an odds ratio of 7.74, so 26% lower odds for primary teeth and 20% lower odds of having decay for the permanent teeth. Next slide, please. In Australia, a well-done study found about 53% less decay in the primary baby teeth, 50% less in the permanent teeth. And a Canadian Armed Forces study found substantially fewer surfaces of decay for the recruits coming in from fluoridated areas. Next slide, please. So if we step back and say, does fluoridation still work? We could easily say yes. However, we need to acknowledge the lower preventive fraction, the percent of prevention, than in the earlier studies when it was the only form of fluoride. Also, all of that was done before Pitt and Fisher sealants, which are the plastic coatings that go over the biting surface or other irregular pits and fissures on the surface of teeth and provide a lot of prevention. So another reason why fluoride isn't as effective. And just as a note here, we had that 1.0 recommended as the average for the nation for all those years, but since 2015, it's been recommended at a 0.7 milligrams per liter to better balance the caries prevention and have a reduced risk of the mostly mild dental fluorosis, acknowledging the other sources of fluoride that help with prevention, but also help with the risk of dental fluorosis. And by the way, the dental fluorosis risk only occurs during those early years of life. So no matter how much we would have now as adults, dental fluorosis does not occur during our later adult years or late adolescent years. Next slide, please. So a few reasons why public health communities emphasize community water fluoridation. It's talked about as universal and equitable since it can prevent caries for all people with teeth, regardless of age, education, income, access to dental or medical care. There are so-called passive benefits just from drinking the water itself or added to other foods and beverages. Doesn't require the active behavior change like very good diet or brushing, flossing, going to the dentist. It's quite inexpensive compared to all other fluoride modalities. And as we'll look at in a minute, substantial cost savings as a result. But I do want to mention that the experts suggest that we cannot achieve maximal caries prevention just by relying on toothpaste and professionally applied fluorides, contrary to what some detractors have said. And a couple reasons for that is that some people don't have ready access to the topical agents. Some don't have toothbrushes, they don't have toothpaste, they don't have ability to go to the dentist or physician easily or to pay for things. And then those topical agents are much more costly and do require that active involvement, the supplements, the toothpaste, the other fluorides. So for that reason, there's no way everyone would get the maximum topical prevention, even if we wanted to. Now, there again have been several recent studies that looked at what happened when a community stopped fluoridating for a period of time, and probably the most well-known one is Calgary in Canada. They discontinued water fluoridation and they then matched it and compared it with Edmonton, a similar city in Alberta, and they found a higher decay prevalence where compared to Calgary, higher compared to Edmonton that continued to fluoridate. They did another study published last year that found approximately twice the rate of general anesthesia needed for severe cavities compared to in Edmonton that had only a 5 to 10% change. Juneau, Alaska discontinued fluoridation and had a 63% increase in their Medicaid claims. Israel, the Minister of Health, discontinued unilaterally, and they had a doubling of the number of restorations, both fillings and crowns placed. Next slide, please. And then there were two publications this year that basically said what would happen if water fluoridation was discontinued in the US nationwide. And one projection just for children, again using NHANES national data, National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey data, estimated there'd be a minimum increase of 7.5% in caries, and it would cost $2 billion more per year for dental treatment costs. And then a group from the Health Policy Institute at the American Dental Association did more detailed analyses for children, middle-aged, and older adults. and estimated a 5-year cost of $46 billion, with the cost varying by state. So for example, in Iowa, a small population state, we would have a $105 million increase per year. So unfortunately, this is what might happen. And Utah and Florida, many of you know, passed laws in May to not allow water fluoridation. And it's very likely that they will have these increased treatment needs and costs and more disease and pain and suffering as well. Next slide, please. And just to let you know, historically, the most recent data we have from a couple of years ago from the Centers for Disease Control, we see very high percentages of those on public water systems, not including non-public water systems, not including individual wells, etc. The upper Midwest, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, as well as the Southeast have higher fluoride coverage generally. And then this doesn't reflect the Utah or Florida change to not allow water fluoridation. Next slide, please. And then to talk about cost effectiveness and cost saving, a review a few years ago of economic evaluations of water fluoridation reported that all 24 studies found cost savings relative to non-fluoridated communities. And another review article estimated that every dollar spent on water fluoridation, and that's the approximate cost for medium-sized communities and larger per year per person, saved about $20 per person. And that's where those projected increased costs come from. And there were recent studies from Ireland and Great Britain found similar cost savings of over $20 per person. Next slide, please. So again, who benefits? Well, water fluoridation reaches wide segments of the community. So nearly everyone gets some benefits, even if they don't have fluoridated water right in their home. But recent studies do show greater levels of prevention among lower income and other underserved communities and populations. So for example, national data recently showed 2 fewer surfaces of baby tooth caries at low income levels, but only 0.4 fewer surfaces at highest income levels, also similar in a nationwide study in Australia. Next slide, please. And here from our Iowa fluoride study, you can see the very steep slope for lower income families with the blue versus a gentler slope of less preventive fraction for the red, which was higher income at the time, 2007 income levels. Next slide, please. So if I were to summarize, and when I'm asked to talk about things, whether to a scientific or lay group, I could summarize it this way, that water fluoridation does work. Discontinuing water fluoridation results in higher caries rates and treatment needs. It is inexpensive and results in substantial net cost savings, and it helps to reduce disparities, both income associated and other disparities in dental caries and oral health. Next slide, please. So let's switch gears now and talk about some of the adverse health claims. And for earlier decades, in the 80s, 90s, and that time era, there were a number of claims about cancer, about shorter lifespan and greater mortality, linked to Down syndrome. Good epidemiologic and other scientific endeavors showed that once proper adjustment was done, those things were not true. For a number of years, there were a lot of discussions about bone health and fluoride. We do know that at high fluoride levels, very high levels, it is associated with bone challenges. For example, above 4 parts per million, higher rates of hip fracture. But most recently, the neurobehavior and especially IQ has been the focus, and especially the past 15 months, and that's primarily what we'll focus on. Next slide, please. But first, I want to mention just a little bit about our fluoride and bone data, in case that's of value to you to have. And there are many methodological limitations and concerns in the literature with both the measuring of the fluoride intake, which usually wasn't done at an individual level, and the bone health outcomes, and also very few longitudinal studies. So our Iowa bone development study, we added it on to our original Iowa fluoride study focus on dental outcomes, and we related bone densitometry outcomes to combined fluoride intake estimates, including a number of sources: the water, other beverages, selected foods that have water added to them or made with water, dietary supplements, and toothpaste. And we've had 6 publications that looked at associations of fluoride intakes over defined 4 to 7 year periods, but also cumulatively from birth, with the outcomes at ages 11 to 23. And we consistently found only weak associations. Back one, please, Deborah. Weak associations, almost all non-significant relationships, and we recently related it to engineering type of finite element analyses of strength at age 23. And next slide, please, and also found very weak associations. So we've concluded that fluoride exposures at typical levels for most US adolescents and young adults, children, and through young adulthood in fluoridated areas do not have significant effects on bone mineral measures through age 23. We do know at much higher levels it can be a concern, but not at the lower level. And just to remind you, since our study was primarily gathering data when water fluoridation was recommended at 1 part per million, there would be an approximate 25 to 30% reduction for those fluoridated community folks in intake now compared to what we were studying. Next slide, please. So the bottom line again is at low dosages, such as with fluoridated water, fluoride appears to have little effect on bone health. And actually that would be the conclusion if we looked at the literature with adults and middle-aged adults and older adults, that fluoridated water at the proper level does not appear to be a concern. It's only at the higher levels. Next slide, please. So let's look at some of the other controversies, and I'm starting with last fall, just over a year ago. Next slide, please. So many of you may remember on Sunday, 33 hours before Election Day, that RFK Jr. was already in the media talking about removing fluoride from water. So it's been a very busy time, and we're going to backtrack to even a few months before that. Next slide, please. So let's look at some science, and I'm going to do it by looking at all of these, some early quality studies, and a special study from Mexico and one from Canada, the National Toxicology Program Review, the Federal District Court case, JAMA Pediatrics, a couple of other more recent studies, and then where are we now? Next slide, please. So there were several dozen early, generally defined as low quality studies, mostly from China, India, and some other places, with very different environmental settings from the US, much higher fluoride levels, mercury, lead, coal burning, a number of other things. And so they were mostly discounted because they didn't have much relevance to the US situation. Then over the past 10 years, we've had publications from the Element study from Mexico, MIREC study from Canada that got much more publicity since they're closer to our US context and geography and were in better journals, despite having some major methodological limitations. Next slide, please. And there's actually a paper from last year written by lead author, a Canadian researcher, who concluded that the MIREC, that Canadian study, should be considered unacceptable for legal and policy purposes because of what she and authors found as important major flaws in the analysis and design of that study. Next slide, please. But then when things really started to be noticed more in this country, was the NTP report. They were working for about 9 years reviewing animal and human evidence about fluoride and neurodevelopment. They had the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine review 2 drafts and identify many deficiencies. It was controversial because NTP draft initially defined fluoride as a presumed neurotoxicant, but NASM challenged them on that. And then in August, 15 months ago, the NTP monograph came out, not as a risk assessment as planned, but as a state of the science. They mentioned a meta-analysis that was going to be published. The removal of the presumed neurotoxicant wording occurred. But in my opinion, this major federal government report did not properly consider study biases of the studies they were looking at, nor separately consider high versus low fluoride levels. Next slide, please. Then a month later, the court case was finally decided. This had been pending for half a dozen years or so also, since before COVID. And the plaintiffs wanted a ruling that the EPA would not be able to allow community water fluoridation, largely due to the reductions in IQ that they were contesting. And in September, the judge ruled that EPA has to respond to the safety concerns, even though the science is far from settled. And he said that he could not conclude with certainty that fluoridated water is injurious to the public health, but he said there's an unreasonable risk of such injury, so EPA has to engage with a regulatory response. EPA appealed that in January, and it'll probably take several years for a court decision if it follows normal EPA procedures, because they often establish an expert panel, often with NASM or another group like that. However, I have heard unofficially that EPA is apparently reviewing fluoride in some form of review now, even though that appeal is not resolved. And if you're interested, ILikeMyTeeth.org is a website from the American Academy of Pediatrics based there in Chicago. And they're very active in trying to enhance oral health of children. And they put on their website some major comments about the flaws of the EPA decision, court case, and saying that it's based on flawed analyses from the NTP report. Next slide, please. And it goes into some important detail about inconsistent findings, confounding factors, measurement, and other things. So that might be useful if you need to get to that level of detail. Next slide, please. So let's fast forward to January, published online the 6th, the meta-analysis and 2 editorials, and it's Taylor et al. For the meta-analysis. They were the authors of this. That was the basis for the NTP report. I was asked to do an editorial, and Dr. Lampier and colleagues apparently had previously committed to do one before I was contacted. Next slide. And so I'm not going to read everything here, but they reported inverse associations and a dose-response association between fluoride and children's IQ. But they acknowledged that there was limited data and more uncertainty about all of this, with fluoride levels less than 1.5 milligrams per liter, which, remember, that's more than twice our recommended level now. And that is also the World Health Organization recommendation not to exceed that. Now, the magnitudes of the differences are generally considered small, and this looks very impressive due to the large amounts of data from the prestigious federal NTP report. But really, this kind of information should be used only to generate hypotheses and not for strong statements that would affect policy. And one big reason is that more than 70% of the studies were rated high risk of bias. And the way they defined it, it had to have 2 or more probably high risk or 1 definitely high risk aspect. And I would suggest if they had included 1 probably high risk like they should have, then they would have excluded even more studies. and there were a number of other methodological challenges. Next slide, please. And there was lots of media headlines. I'm sure most of you saw something about it in early January. These were the first few days as it was published. Next slide, please. So just a quick comment. When I was asked to do this editorial, I was told that the manuscript was conditionally accepted, but not final. This was back in September. And that they already had agreement for an editorial that endorsed the meta-analysis, which later I found out was the Lampier et al. And when I did a quick skimming of the manuscript that night, I saw some major methodological concerns, and I told them the next day that I would recommend they delay acceptance to address them more. But then literally the next day, after the initial inquiry, they said it was already too late and now it was fully accepted. So I'm not sure, but it sure seems like maybe they were more interested in media publicity than what I might call the best science. But I decided it was very important to write this editorial to try to have a balancing perspective for public health folks to use to better understand what the information might or might not mean. Next slide, please. So many of you may have seen this before, but I wanted to provide an alternative perspective. I said that due to the limitations of the data and the things the authors did, their results and conclusions are not what is the current state of our information and knowledge. I mentioned a number of important factors like lack of transparency. They didn't mention this was 9 years of work. They didn't really mention it was linked to NTP. They didn't mention the NASEM committee finding deficiencies. They didn't mention that their own comprehensive animal review found no evidence of concern. Next slide, please. And then other important factors, just to list them, the high risk of bias, inadequate justification of some studies, lack of adequate discussion of other studies that were new at that point, concerns with high data heterogeneity, where you mix data that shouldn't be put together to get a single estimate, concerns about using single spot urine measures that are not complete measures of fluoride exposure, and the lack of context for low versus high fluoride exposures, and a couple other factors. Next slide, please. And so to summarize, I tried to emphasize that there is very little valid data from which to conclude that the very important benefits of community water fluoridation should be taken away due to these flawed analyses and conclusions. Next slide, please. Now, there was this other editorial that I'm going to just briefly mention, Lampier et al. They emphasized several factors about the reduced effectiveness, mostly topical, the inverse relationship, total fluoride intake's important, and they concluded it's time for health organizations and regulatory bodies to reassess the risks and benefits, particularly for pregnant women and infants. But they did not acknowledge the caries prevention and cost savings are still substantial, that water fluoridation is an important topical source, the major quality and bias aspects, and the fact that high fluoride should be clearly separated from low. So in my opinion, the EPA maximum contaminant level of 4 probably should be reconsidered. And even in 2006, the National Research Council expert panel recommended that be looked at. But in my opinion and many others, it's not appropriate to be changing recommendations or disallowing the recommended water fluoride level, fluoridation level of 0.7. Next slide, please. And so this was just, again, the media right after that. And Dr. Lampier and I both were on NBC TV News for a few seconds that evening talking about things. Next slide, please. So I want to just make sure you have a couple more recent studies before we finish here. Next slide, please. And one was a very well done cohort study from Spain that found statistically significantly higher IQ in boys, but not girls. And by the way, that earlier study I mentioned only found in girls the higher level, not in boys, from Mexico. Another well-done study published just last December from Australia found slightly higher IQ levels with lifelong community water fluoridation or partial lifelong, not statistically significant, so they concluded no harmful effects on cognitive development. Next slide, please. And importantly, a meta-analysis published the year before the NTP report by Kumar et al. Properly separated fluoride levels less than 1.5 from the much higher ones. And they found no association whatsoever with the lower IQ with lower fluoride levels up to 1.5, possible elevated risk only in the higher fluoride situations. So next slide, please. So here, if you look at the top, these were averaging 3.7 milligrams per liter in the high fluoride group in the top part of this. And you see that black diamond to the left of the vertical line, meaning a negative effect is the point estimate average. But if you look down in the smaller number of studies down below, most of them, the green dot is to the right of that line, and the triangle or diamond rather is slightly to the right. So it was not statistically significant, but it showed a slight positive effect. And then the inappropriate thing that the NTP report did, and the JAMA, in my opinion, is to emphasize a lot the bottom diamond there, where it combines all of them rather than separately talking about low fluoride versus high fluoride. And then this is similarly, if we look at lower exposure for children's urinary and maternal urinary, and if we look just at those places that had lower fluoride levels, then again, we overlap that zero line. It's only the salt fluoridation down below that is negative. Next slide, please. And Dr. Kumar shared with me a slide where he put together the unadjusted mean IQ or cognition scores for 5 different studies, 6 different groups. And all 6 of these, the orange is just a tiny bit higher than the green and no significant differences, but certainly no evidence of concern. And note a number of these are much higher than the so-called average IQ of 100, even in the fluoridated. Next slide, please. So let's fast forward again now. Where are we? Well, there's great uncertainty about what RFK Jr. and the federal government will do, not only about water fluoridation, but also our vaccines, our other public health measures, our climate change, and many other things. But certainly the statements that he and other officials have made have complicated things and undermine efforts for water fluoridation. And the state bans in Utah and Florida are likely to continue to encourage greater state legislative activity in January when most states start again. There were about 14 or 15 states that had some discussions about restricting water fluoridation, although a couple, one passed a law to better structure it and require it, and another couple looked at enhancing their fluoridation structures as well. Next slide, please. And so just briefly, a couple slides of what we can all do, medical, dental, scientific community, if you want to support and preserve community water fluoridation based on my summary of the current state of the science. So next slide, please. Just to let you know, we've had more challenges in Iowa during the last 16 years than in maybe 50 years before that. A lot of challenges in our bigger cities and also small towns. Next slide. And so we need to realize we can never prove safety, and opponents only need to raise a small question of doubt for a prudent person to avoid exposure. The internet and social media complicate things, and some opponents of fluoridation are very effective at using them. And sometimes in small towns, an individual has even more influence than they might in a bigger setting. Next slide, please. And remember, we have public distrust of government and authority, mainstream media, health authorities. Many folks have low scientific knowledge. There's confusion since so much information is coming at people all the time, and more concern about conspiracy theories. Next slide, please. And we all have intense allegiance to our group and reinforcement and polarization. Most of us spend more time with like-minded individuals, and it's all exaggerated with social media, except for those of us that don't get on social media. And these really make public health activities difficult. The COVID-19 prevention, other vaccinations, water fluoridation, a lot of things. Now, in my opinion, we're fortunate in the upper Midwest especially that most decent-sized communities have been fluoridated for many decades, since it would be more difficult to initiate them in every community now. Next slide, please. I do want you to know there's a new publication from the American Dental Association, an updated version of Fluoridation Facts, which is available free as an ebook. So take advantage of that if you want to have a primer on a lot of different information about things for fluoridation. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, there's no clear evidence of harmful effects related to optimally fluoridated water. The measured preventive benefit is smaller, but still very substantial. It's the most efficient, cost-effective, and cost-saving way to prevent caries, especially for the underserved. And physicians, dentists, scientists should be part of a broad-based community team supporting community water fluoridation to ensure ongoing success. So thanks very much for your patience. Sorry we went just a couple minutes over, but I'll look forward to Deborah fielding the questions you've already submitted, and also feel free to contact me in the future independently, separately, if you want additional information or I can help in some way.
Thank you, Dr. Levy. We appreciate your presentation. A lot of good details, a lot of detailed information. There's a couple of questions in our Q&A box here. So one question is, how can you say that fluoridation does not add anything new to water? The writer says that he does not feel that that's a truthful statement. And he'd like you to comment on that, including the fact that sometimes it's contaminated with arsenic or a known carcinogen.
Okay, well, obviously what I'm meaning is that all water sources have some level of fluoride in them. In most cases, it's a detectable level, so it may be a low level. And if, for example, it's 0.2 parts per million, that's very common in Iowa and Illinois and other places, then we would add 0.5 milligrams of fluoride to that to get it to the 0.7. So if, in my opinion, if I'm talking to a family or a parent, a patient, they may think that it's a very foreign substance, that fluoride is an artificial something, but it's naturally occurring in the Earth's crust. It is the same fluoride, whether it's naturally occurring or whether it's coming from some other source. It's metabolized the same in the body for the Dmin, Riemann, and other effects. So that's what I was talking about. Certainly we're increasing the amount when we adjust the fluoridation level, but that's what I was referring to. And you know, there are contaminants in a lot of different waters. I'm not an expert on all of the other environmental aspects. Many of the studies that have been done in other countries, there's major contamination, like I said, sometimes with arsenic, even as was mentioned. So that does need to be looked at. If there's arsenic in the water, then that's not desirable. If there's lead in the water, it's not. But fluoride is being adjusted to that proper level.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Are there additional benefits or risks of water fluoridation?
Well, There are other things that sometimes are looked at, and there have been, as I said, those early studies finding different cancer risks, mortality risks. The problem is when things are not adjusted for other factors like urbanization in those early cancer studies, then it's not a true proper reading of that. There have been some studies that have talked about other organ systems being at risk, and the 2006 NRC report of fluoride reviewed that extensively and said that continued monitoring was needed. It's also maybe worth pointing out that in July of last year, just about a month before the NTP report came out, EPA finished their required 7-year review of fluoridation, of fluoride, I'm sorry, as a so-called contaminant, along with the other 15 or so that they're required to look at every 7 years. And they decided there was not sufficient evidence to warrant a full detailed panel and review and all like 2003 to 2006 was. And then the new information came out, and that's why they likely will impanel a group to look at all that, whether things with thyroid or with other systems are a problem. I mentioned the high fluoride at 8 to 10 parts per million for 4, 5, 6 decades, you can get skeletal fluorosis. The risk of fracture for hip especially at 4 or higher parts per million. But most every study finds either no evidence or very equivocal concerns when we're looking at the low levels of fluoride. And also remember, we now have that extra little bit of protection because most earlier studies, and even now, if you look at fluoridated versus not, and you're talking about, say, 30 years of history of fluoridation, that would have been back at that 1 part per million rather than 0.7. So all those need to continue to be monitored. But the basic thing that fluoride does is to strengthen the teeth in a day-to-day, minute-by-minute. Demineralization initiates and remineralization keeps you in balance so you don't get actual holes in your teeth that need filling.
Thank you for those comments. And so those comments, that would include also osteoporosis, fractures, dementia, and renal insufficiency. Is that
Yeah, at one
correct?
time there was more concern about, the bone and the osteoporosis is the cause of so many of those hip fractures when people have lost bone, osteopenia before osteoporosis. Interestingly, 30 to 40 years ago, there was a bunch of work to use high fluoride as a therapy, about 30 to 40 milligrams per day as a therapy for osteoporosis. And then when Fosamax came out and $100 million advertising budget from Merck, then the interest in better testing of fluoride went by the wayside because fluoride is known to be able to increase bone mass, but they were working on trying to get the bone quality to be good and not have it compromised. And so there really are no important, credible articles about associations that we need to worry about with cognitive development for adults, Alzheimer's, other dementias.
Okay, good. So before we wrap up here, is there anything that we should look at as there's many clinicians who will be viewing this presentation away from today as well, but also for lay people. What should we look at, like on our toothpaste or fluoride products or other rinses that we're looking at in order to protect ourselves?
Well, there's the two dimensions. What can you do to get the enhanced cavity prevention? And that's where your dentist and dental hygienist will be the experts. But using fluoride toothpaste and having access to fluoridated water if possible, they were the recommendations from the Centers for Disease Control in the first and only national recommendations for fluoride in MMWR in 2001. So that's the foundation for everyone. And then it's recommended if you're at higher risk, you can use those fluoride mouth rinses, prescription or over the counter. And remember, most adults, even if you have good dental insurance, you don't get coverage for fluoride at the dental office. It's just not part of what's done. But you should talk with your dentist if you're having cavities. Then the dentist can provide that, and it's important added prevention, but you'll just have to pay for it. And then obviously you want to make sure you're not having extremely high levels of fluoride in your water. If you have an individual well and you have no idea what's in it, it's unlikely, but in Illinois and Iowa, for example, unlikely, but there could be a very high fluoride level, especially if it's a very deep well. So you might just get that checked out and make sure it's not super high. Most of us on public water systems, you get the annual notice from your water system of all of the required information on the roughly 15 things they have to report to you on in the consumer information report, so you can tell things there. So that would be the two things to think about. Make sure, and then with your young children or grandchildren, nephews, nieces, we want them to use a very small amount of fluoride toothpaste. The infant, 1, 2-year-old, it's for about 10 years now, it's been talked about as a smear, like a grain of rice size, not even a small pea-sized amount that we recommend for the toddler age 3 to 6. So that would be another thing to supervise the young children, make sure they're not eating a whole lot of toothpaste because they like the fact that it's flavored for children.
Yeah, definitely. It's not candy.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Levy. We appreciate all of your patience today with our questions and also all the information. So we're near closing right now. I'm sure we could talk about about a little bit more, but in the interest of time and respect to everyone, we're going to close out. So thank you once again to everyone who's attended today. Keep in mind that the Institute of Medicine of Chicago is an independent 501c3. It is supported by its membership and donations. So if you are appreciative of today's presentation and also the efforts of the Institute, please consider donating today. You can go to our website, or you can use the QR code that's here on the slide. Our overall mission is to support and advance health equity by reducing healthcare disparities. So thank you again, and if we can be of assistance to you in any way, please do not hesitate to contact us at www.iomc.org. Have a good day and a remainder of the week. Take care.
Thanks so much, Deborah.
Thank you, Dr. Levy. We appreciate it.